The gavel came down hard, and Charlotte Fletcher felt the sound of it like a fist to her chest. Sold to Mr. Harlan Voss for the sum of $4,000. The crowd in the dusty auction house erupted. Men in fine suits clapped each other on the back. Harlan Voss, broad-shouldered and grinning beneath his waxed mustache, rose from his chair and extended his hand to shake with the auctioneer, as though the deal were already ironclad and done. As though Charlotte and her 8-year-old son, and the grave of her late husband, and the 3 years of blood and calloused hands she had poured into that land, simply did not exist. She was on her feet before she even consciously decided to move. "You cannot do this," she said, her voice cutting through the applause like a blade. "That is my land. My husband homesteaded it under the Homestead Act of 1862. It is registered. It is legal." The auctioneer, a thin man named Prout with ink-stained fingers and a nervous habit of blinking too fast, held up both hands. "Mrs. Fletcher, the county has deemed the original filing to be incomplete on account of your husband's passing before the 5-year claim period was satisfied." "The land reverts to nobody," said a voice from the back of the room. Every head turned. The man who had spoken stood just inside the doorway. One shoulder leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. He wore a marshal's badge on the breast of a worn leather vest, and his gray eyes moved slowly across the room with the kind of calm that does not come from comfort but from absolute certainty. He was tall, lean in the way that men who have ridden hard country get lean, and the dust on his boots told the story of a long road taken in a hurry. "This land," Marshal Seth Talbot said, pushing off the doorframe and walking into the room, "was never legally on the block." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Charlotte Fletcher had ever heard. Harlan Voss's smile did not disappear all at once. It faded the way color fades from a sunset, slow and then suddenly completely gone. "Marshal," he said, his voice smooth and controlled, "I don't believe you have jurisdiction in a civil land matter." "I have jurisdiction in a matter of fraud," Seth said, and he reached into his vest and produced a folded document, which he placed on the auctioneer's table with the kind of deliberate precision that left no room for argument. "That is a federal order from the Department of the Interior, signed 3 days ago, staying the county's authority to auction any land that falls under an active homestead dispute. Mrs. Fletcher filed that dispute 4 weeks ago in Abilene. The county conveniently forgot to mention it." Prout the auctioneer stared at the document like it might bite him. Voss's jaw tightened. "This is an outrage." "No," Seth said quietly, his eyes moving to Charlotte's across the crowded room. For just a moment something passed between them that neither of them could have named. "What was happening here is an outrage. This is a correction." That was the moment Charlotte Fletcher's life changed direction so completely that she would later think of her years as existing in 2 separate halves, before Seth Talbot walked through that door and after. But neither of them knew that yet. Neither of them knew anything about the other, not really, and the road between that auction house and the life they would eventually build together was long and tangled and lit by danger on every side. To understand how they arrived at that moment, you have to go back 6 weeks. The town of Caldera, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, was the kind of place that looked peaceable on the surface and rotted underneath. It sat at the edge of the Flint Hills, where the grass ran silver in the wind, and the sky was so wide it could make a person feel both free and utterly alone at the same time. It had a main street with a general store, a telegraph office, a saloon called the Red Hawk, a small church, and a land registry office that everyone in town knew was under the thumb of a man named Harlan Voss. Voss owned the bank. Voss owned the feed store. Voss had fingers in the cattle contracts that ran through Caldera, and he had recently decided that the 160 acres of rich bottom land along Sweetwater Creek, the land that had belonged to James Fletcher before a fever took him 18 months ago, was the last piece of the puzzle that would make him the most powerful man in 3 counties. Charlotte Fletcher had not been told that she was a puzzle piece. She had been told instead by the county clerk that her husband's homestead claim was void because James had died before completing the full 5-year residency requirement, and that the land, legally speaking, now belonged to the county to dispose of as it saw fit. She had not believed it, not because she was naive, but because she had read the Homestead Act herself, more than once, sitting at the kitchen table by lamplight while James slept. She knew that a widow could inherit a homestead claim. She knew that she had rights. What she did not know, not yet, was that the county clerk was a man named Daltrey who owed Harlan Voss $900 in gambling debts, and that the law in Caldera had been quietly, carefully shaped into something that served Voss's interests and no one else's. Charlotte had ridden to Abilene alone, leaving her son Danny in the care of her neighbor Me Dunning, and had filed a formal dispute with the federal land office there. The clerk at that office, a young man named Elroy who took his job seriously, had looked at her documentation with wide eyes and said, "Ma'am, if what you're showing me is accurate, there's been a deliberate misrepresentation of federal homestead law." He had sent telegrams that same afternoon. One of those telegrams had reached the desk of Seth Talbot. Seth was 31 years old in the spring of 1878, and he had been a United States Marshal for 4 years, assigned to the Western District of Kansas out of Wichita. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a schoolteacher and a man who drove cattle for other men his whole life and never owned a thing he could call his own. He had studied law for 2 years before the money ran out, and the frontier called louder than the courtroom, and he carried that half-finished education around inside him like a compass that occasionally made him a difficult man to deceive. He was not, his fellow marshals would tell you, the most talkative man in the territory. He was not given to long explanations or to the kind of swagger that a lot of men in his profession leaned on. What he was thorough. When Seth Talbot took on a case, he did not let it go until it was done, properly done, with all the loose threads pulled tight. When Elroy's telegram crossed his desk describing a possible coordinated land fraud scheme in Caldera, Kansas, Seth had read it twice, then once more, then folded it carefully and set it beside his coffee cup and stared at the wall for a long time. He had seen things like this before. He knew how they worked. A powerful man with local connections, a bought county official, a widow or a small farmer with no political pull and no money for a real attorney. The machinery of it was the same every time. What varied was how far the damage had gone before someone stopped it. He rode for Caldera the next morning. He did not send word ahead. That was deliberate. In a situation where local officials were compromised, announcing your arrival was the same as giving the opposition time to paper over the evidence. He rode hard for 2 days, stopping only when the horse needed it, and he arrived in Caldera late on a Tuesday evening when the streets were mostly quiet, and the Red Hawk was throwing yellow lamplight, and the sound of an off-key piano out into the cooling night air. He took a room at the boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Crane, ate a cold supper, and spent most of the night reading through the documents he had collected in Abilene before riding out. James Fletcher's original homestead filing, the county clerk's ruling declaring it void, and a separate note from Elroy indicating that Harlan Voss's name appeared on a certificate of purchase for the same land dated only 11 days after the county's ruling. 11 days. The speed of it told Seth everything he needed to know about how much this had been planned in advance. The next morning, he visited the land registry office. Daltrey, the county clerk, was a heavy-set man with a red face that went redder when Seth placed his marshal's badge on the desk between them and asked, very politely, to see the full record of the Fletcher homestead claim and all associated correspondence. Daltrey said the files were in storage. Seth said he would wait. Daltrey said it might take some time to locate them. Seth said he had plenty of time, and he sat down in the single chair across from Daltrey's desk and did not move. After 45 minutes, Daltrey produced a folder. Seth read through it carefully, asked several quiet questions, and left without making any accusations. But before he left, he noted 3 specific inconsistencies in the paperwork that told him the county's ruling had been generated not from any genuine legal analysis, but from whole cloth. He went back to the boarding house and wrote out the telegram he needed to send to the Department of the Interior. Then he walked to the telegraph office and stood there while the operator sent it, watching the man's face the entire time, because in a town where Voss owned most of what mattered, the telegraph office was also a likely point of compromise. It was on his way back from the telegraph office that he first saw Charlotte Fletcher. She was coming out of the general store with a paper-wrapped parcel in her arms, and a small boy of perhaps 8 walking beside her with his hands in his pockets. She was wearing a calico dress the color of deep summer sky, and her dark hair was pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and the look on her face was the specific look of a woman who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has decided that she is not going to set it down. She stopped walking because she nearly walked directly into Seth, who had come around the corner of the mercantile porch without enough attention to where he was going. "Pardon me," he said, stepping back and touching the brim of his hat. "Entirely my fault," she said, and then her eyes dropped to the badge on his chest and something shifted in her expression. Wariness first, then something more complicated than that. "Marshal," she said, "are you passing through?" "No, ma'am, I have some business in Caldera." Her chin lifted slightly. What kind of business? He should have given her a vague answer. He was not entirely sure yet how much anyone in town could be trusted, and he was still gathering his information. But there was something in her directness that made him answer honestly. "Land matters," he said. The boy at her side tugged her sleeve. "Mama." She glanced down, then back at Seth, and in that moment he saw in her face the full weight of what she was carrying. Not just grief, though that was there, wound into the corners of her eyes. There was something else. Fear and determination in equal measure, the particular combination that appears on the faces of people who are fighting for something they cannot afford to lose. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, because Elroy's telegram had included her name and it was already fixed in his mind. She went still. "You know who I am." "I know your name," he said carefully. "I think we should talk." They sat in the small side room of the general store, which belonged to the owner, a pragmatic man named Holt who had known Charlotte for 3 years and who quietly closed the door and left them to it when Seth explained he was a federal marshal. Charlotte told him everything. She told him about James, about the homestead, about the fever that had taken him in the fall of 1876, about the 18 months she had spent working the land herself with her son, and a hired hand named Cord who had stayed on out of loyalty, and a sense of decency that Charlotte said she would never stop being grateful for. She told him about Daltrey's ruling, about her trip to Abilene, about the land auction that had been scheduled for 2 weeks hence, and about the way Harlan Voss had smiled at her across the street last week in a way that she described as the smile of a man who has already won. Seth listened to all of it without interrupting. He took no notes, but his eyes were steady on her face the whole time, and she had the curious sensation that he was not just hearing her words but filing them away with a precision that a written record could not match. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The ruling Daltrey issued is not valid," he said. "Under federal law, a surviving spouse is entitled to assume a homestead claim, provided the necessary residency period is completed. You have lived on that land for 18 months since your husband's death. The 5-year period your husband began can be completed by you. Daltrey either didn't know that or, more likely, was paid not to know it." Charlotte's hands were clasped in her lap, and he could see the tension in them. "Can you stop the auction? I've already requested a federal stay order. It should come through before the auction date." He paused. "But I need to be honest with you, Mrs. Fletcher. A stay order stops the auction. It doesn't resolve the underlying situation. If Voss has enough influence in this county, he'll find another avenue, another legal maneuver, another bought official. Getting you the land permanently is a longer fight." She met his eyes without flinching. "I have been in a long fight before," she said. "I can manage it." He believed her. He believed it with an immediacy that surprised him, because in his experience, people often said things like that before they understood what the fight would cost them. But something in Charlotte Fletcher's expression told him that she already knew the cost, had already calculated it, and had decided to pay it anyway. "There's something else you should know," she said, and her voice dropped slightly. "3 nights ago, someone cut the fence on my north pasture. Cord found it in the morning. It might have been weather, but the cuts were clean. And last week, someone moved the markers on my eastern boundary, moved them 4 feet into my land." Seth's jaw tightened. "Harassment," he said. "Intimidation," she corrected quietly. "He wants me to leave before the auction. He wants me to give up and go back to wherever he thinks a widow with a child should go." "Where was that?" A small, dry smile crossed her face. "I don't know. Somewhere without land worth $4,000, I suppose." Seth stood and retrieved his hat from the table. "I'm going to speak to Voss today," he said. "He'll deny everything." "He will," Seth agreed. "But now he'll know someone is watching, and men who rely on darkness tend to get more careful when a light gets pointed at them. Careful men make mistakes." He was at the door when she spoke again. "Marshal Talbot," he turned. "Thank you for coming. I was beginning to think no one at the federal level had actually read what I sent." "Elroy at the Abilene office reads everything very carefully," Seth said. "He's a good man." "So are you," she said. And then she seemed to realize she had said it out loud and looked away toward the small square window where the Kansas morning was bright and indifferent beyond the glass. Seth left without another word, but he carried her voice with him out into the street like a thing he had been handed and not yet figured out what to do with. He found Harlan Voss at the bank, which was the kind of bank that was designed to look impregnable, all solid wood and iron fittings, and the particular atmosphere of entrenched money. Voss came out from behind the railing himself when the clerk announced a marshal's visit, and he wore the expression of a man accustomed to dealing with authority from a position of complete confidence. "Marshal Talbot," he said, extending his hand. "What can Caldera's financial institution do for the federal law enforcement community today?" Seth shook the hand briefly. "I'd like to talk about the Fletcher land." Voss's expression did not change. "A county matter," he said smoothly. "The land was properly declared available for purchase after the original claim lapsed due to the claim holder's death. Everything was done by the book." "The book is federal law," Seth said, "and the county's interpretation of it is incorrect. I've requested a stay on the auction." Something moved behind Voss's eyes. It was brief and quickly controlled, but Seth had spent 4 years watching men's faces at the moment their plans encountered resistance, and he recognized what he saw. This was not surprise. This was recalculation. "Well," Voss said pleasantly, "if there's a legal question, I'm sure it'll be sorted out in the proper fashion. I have no objection to that." He smiled. "I'm a law-abiding man, Marshal." "I imagine you are," Seth said, and left it at that. But on his way out of the bank, Seth passed a man coming in who he clocked as not being there on bank business. The man was broad, wore a gun low on his hip, and had the specific kind of flat, assessing eyes that belonged to men who were paid to solve problems that polite conversation could not solve. He looked at Seth the way those men always looked at marshals, and Seth looked back at him the same way, and there was a full understanding between them without a word exchanged. Voss had hired muscle. That was useful to know. That evening, Seth rode out to the Fletcher homestead. The land was everything the paperwork had suggested. Rich bottom land running down to Sweetwater Creek. The grass already coming in thick and green after the spring rains. Cottonwood trees along the water with their new leaves showing silver in the late afternoon light. The farmhouse was modest but well-maintained, and there was a kitchen garden beside it that someone had been working recently. The soil turned dark and even in neat rows. Charlotte came to the door before he reached it, which told him she had been watching the road. The boy, Danny, appeared behind her with wide eyes and a cautious expression. "I wanted to see it," Seth said, pulling up his horse. "If you don't mind." I don't mind." He dismounted, and they walked the property while the light lasted, and Charlotte talked about it with the specific love of someone who has worked a thing into existence with their own hands. She showed him where James had first broken the ground, the original furrow mark still visible in the east field. She showed him the well James had dug, the root cellar they had built together the second autumn, the small orchard of apple trees she had planted herself last year, tiny and still more hope than tree, but growing. "He worked himself to death for this land," she said, and her voice was steady, but her hands hanging at her sides were not. Not in a careless way. In the way that people work when they believe in something. He believed this land would be the foundation of something good, for Danny, for she stopped. "For both of you," Seth finished quietly. She looked at him sideways. Yes. They were standing near the creek by then, and the evening light was going golden, and the water was making its constant quiet sound over the stones, and Seth was aware of being in a place that was beautiful and fragile and under genuine threat, and he was aware of being aware of Charlotte Fletcher standing beside him in a way that went slightly beyond professional concern, and into territory he was not going to examine too carefully right now. "I'll stay until this is resolved," he said, "not just until the auction, until it's properly resolved." She turned to look at him fully. "That could take months. I know what it could take." A pause stretched between them. A hawk circled lazily over the creek, riding the last warm air of the day. "Why?" she asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. "You could issue the stay order and go back to Wichita, file the report, send someone else to follow up." He could have. He knew that. He had thought about it in the abstract way he thought about most things, turning it over and looking at it from different angles. He could have done exactly what she described. The professional version of what was required here did not demand that he stay. "Because Voss has someone on his payroll who carries a gun for non-banking purposes," Seth said. "And because you have a son and hired help who aren't marshals, and because leaving this half-finished would mean it doesn't get finished." He paused. "That is the professional reasoning." She caught the qualifier. He could see it in the slight change of her expression. She did not pursue it, and he was grateful because he would not have known what to say if she had. He rode back to town in the dark, and he ate supper at the boarding house, and Mrs. Crane, who was not a woman given to minding her own business, asked him how long he planned to stay, and he said he was not sure, and she said that was the answer of a man whose plans had recently gotten complicated, and he said good night and went to his room. He did not sleep for a long time. The next 2 weeks were a kind of education for Seth Talbot in the specific texture of a community under the shadow of a powerful man's influence. He talked to the ranchers who ran cattle on land adjacent to the Fletcher homestead. He talked to the feed store owner, who was more forthcoming than he expected. He talked to the minister at the small church, who spoke carefully but whose silences were informative. He talked, briefly and once, to the gunman he had seen at the bank, whose name was Brace and who confirmed nothing but whose presence was itself a kind of confirmation. What he learned was that Harlan Voss had been quietly accumulating land around Caldera for 2 years. He had bought several properties at fair prices, which was not itself illegal, but he had also, in at least 3 cases that Seth could trace, encouraged the outcome he wanted through means that were not fair at all. A small ranch north of town, whose owner had been persuaded to sell after his water supply was mysteriously contaminated. A farm to the west, whose owner had received a visit from Brace and 2 other men the night before he signed the deed. And now the Fletcher homestead, where the approach was legal manipulation rather than direct threat, because Charlotte's land was valuable enough that Voss wanted a clean title and not a contested one. The irony was, Seth thought, that the cleaner Voss tried to make it, the cleaner the evidence of fraud became. He was also spending time at the homestead, which he told himself was necessary. Charlotte needed someone with legal and physical authority nearby while the threat was ongoing. Cord, the hired hand, was a solid and reliable man, but he was one man without a badge. The situation required a presence with federal standing. This was accurate. It was also incomplete, and Seth knew it was incomplete, and he kept riding out there anyway. On his fourth visit, Danny asked him if he had ever shot anyone, with the forthright bluntness that belongs to 8-year-old boys and to nobody else. Seth said that he had, and that it was never something a person felt good about, and Danny looked at him with the evaluating seriousness of a child who is trying to work out whether a grown man is telling the truth or telling the comfortable version of it. He apparently decided it was the truth, because he nodded, and then asked if Seth could show him how to properly clean a rifle, and Charlotte called from the kitchen that supper was ready and Danny was not getting rifle lessons before he finished his reading. Seth ate supper at the Fletcher table that evening. He had not quite intended to. Charlotte had simply asked him to stay, the way you ask someone to stay when you are used to asking without expectation of yes, and he had said yes before he thought about it carefully. The table was set for 3, and Danny talked about his schoolwork and about a hawk's nest he had found in the cottonwoods by the creek, and about a boy at school named Tolley who had said something about their land being sold and whether that was true. And Charlotte said it was not going to be true, and she said it with such certainty that Danny accepted it and moved on to talking about the hawk. And Seth watched her face while she talked to her son and felt something shift in his chest that he recognized. With some alarm, as the specific kind of feeling he had been very careful to avoid for several years. After Danny was in bed, Charlotte poured 2 cups of coffee and they sat on the porch in the cool spring night with the creek making its sound in the dark and the stars enormous overhead. "He's a good boy," Seth said. "He is," she agreed, and her voice held that particular quality of a parent speaking about their child, love so deep it has become ordinary. "He's very like James. The same steadiness. James never panicked about anything. He just looked at the problem until he could see the shape of it and then figured out what to do." She paused. "I used to think that was the most comforting quality a person could have. Now I think I also have it, which is useful." "You do," Seth said. "Have it?" She looked at him. "Is that a professional assessment?" "It's an observation." The silence between them was the comfortable kind, which was new. Seth had known this woman for less than 2 weeks, and already the silences between them had that quality, and he was not sure what to do with that either. "Tell me about you," she said. "You know everything about my situation. You've read all my paperwork and walked my land and eaten my cooking. That's a considerable imbalance." He told her about Missouri, about his father and the cattle driving, about the 2 years of law school that had run out of funding before they ran out of purpose. He told her about the marshaling, about Wichita, about the particular satisfaction and particular cost of a job that was always moving and never quite complete. "You've never," she started, and then she seemed to reconsider how to phrase it. "Married? No. I wasn't going to ask that directly. I know, but it's what you were working up to, and the answer saves time." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I came close once, a woman in Wichita. But she wanted someone who came home at the same time every evening and who wouldn't ride out into hostile territory for months on end, and she was right to want that. I just wasn't the man who could provide it." He paused. "I don't know if I still can't or if it's different than I thought it was." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "Different how?" He looked at her. The lamplight from inside the house came through the window and caught the line of her cheek, and she was watching him with an expression that was open in a way that some people never achieve, a directness that held no pretense in it, that said, "Whatever you say here I will hear as it is meant." "I don't know yet," he said honestly. She nodded slowly, as if she was placing that answer somewhere safe. 3 days before the auction, the stay order arrived by telegraph from the Department of the Interior, and Seth sent a copy to Daltrey's office with a formal written notice that the auction could not legally proceed. Daltrey sent word to Voss within the hour. Seth knew this because Brace and another man showed up outside the boarding house that evening while Seth was on the porch, and they stood on the opposite side of the street looking at him for a long time, and then they left. It was a message, very clearly a message, and Seth received it and did not change his posture or his expression. But that night, he rode to the Fletcher homestead and told Charlotte that he was going to stay in the bunkhouse for the next few nights, because the opposition had now understood that their auction was not going forward and that unpredictable behavior was possible. "You think they'd come here," she said, and he could see her calculating, not panicking, calculating. "I think Voss has too much invested to simply accept the stay order and walk away. He'll either try to find a legal workaround, which takes time, or someone with poor judgment might try something physical to accelerate his options." He met her eyes. "I want to be here." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The bunkhouse is clean. Cord keeps it decent. There's a blanket on the top bunk." It was not a declaration of anything. It was a practical answer to a practical situation. But when she said good night and went inside, Seth stood on the porch for a while in the dark listening to the creak, and the feeling in his chest was something he had stopped trying to explain away. Cord was a quiet man of perhaps 40, with a face like worn saddle leather and eyes that had seen considerable country. He accepted Seth's presence in the bunkhouse with a nod and no excessive commentary, which Seth appreciated. On the second morning, over coffee before dawn, Cord said, "She won't leave this land," not as a warning, but as a simple statement of fact, offered the way you tell someone important information about terrain before a long ride. "I know," Seth said. Cord looked at him steadily. "Good." The auction was scheduled for a Wednesday. On the Monday before it, despite the stay order, the auctioneer Prout went ahead and posted notices in town that the auction would proceed as planned. When Seth brought this to Charlotte, she looked at the notice with the particular expression of someone who has expected a betrayal and still feels the sting of it. "So they're going to pretend the stay order doesn't exist," she said. "They're testing whether anyone will enforce it," Seth said. "The county has no obligation to enforce a federal order unless a federal officer is present to do so, which is why I'll be at that auction." She nodded. Then she said, "I want to be there too." He started to say something about safety. "It is my land," she said, and the quiet firmness of it ended the discussion. They rode into town together on Wednesday morning, Charlotte on her bay mare and Seth on his roan, with Danny left at Me Dunning's house, and Cord riding behind them at a distance that suggested he was not accompanying them officially, but was accompanying them nonetheless. The auction house was the meeting hall at the back of the feed store, and it was already half full when they arrived. Seth recognized several faces from his inquiries: ranchers who were there out of curiosity, men who were there because Voss had put money in front of them, and two of Voss's hired men standing against the wall with their thumbs in their belts, and the flat-eyed patience of men who had been told to be present and be visible. Seth positioned himself at the back of the room, while Charlotte took a seat near the front. He watched the room fill, watched Voss arrive and take his seat with the air of a man attending a formality, watched Prout arrange his papers at the front table with the elaborate busyness of a man trying not to look at what he knows is coming. The auction started. Charlotte rose to object and Prout spoke over her. Voss bid. The gavel came down, and Seth walked to the front of that room. He placed the stay order on Prout's table. He said the words that cut through the noise and the congratulations and the careful arrangement of a corrupt man's victory. This land was never legally on the block, and the room went very quiet. Voss recovered quickly, as Seth had known he would. The legal argument followed. The county's authority, the question of federal jurisdiction, the validity of the original claim. It was a performance for the room, because Voss was smart enough to know that the legal battle was going to continue regardless, but smart enough too to understand that perception mattered, and that he needed the people of Caldera to see him as a man fighting for his rights rather than a man caught at fraud. Seth answered every argument calmly and precisely, citing the relevant sections of the Homestead Act and the terms of the federal stay. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The document on Prout's table spoke for itself. Charlotte had turned in her chair and was watching him. In her face was something he could not fully read. Relief, certainly, and the residual shock of having come so close to losing, but underneath those things something else, something that was quietly, carefully beginning to look like trust. Voss left the auction house without another word, and his men filed out after him, and the room gradually emptied until it was just Seth and Charlotte and Cord, who had stood just inside the door the whole time, and Prout, who was staring at his papers with the expression of a man who has decided he is in the wrong profession. Charlotte stood up. She walked down the length of the room to where Seth stood, and she said, very quietly, "How do we finish this? We file with the county court for formal recognition of the stay and initiate a federal review of Daltrey's original ruling. The Department of the Interior has already flagged this case. With the documentation I have, we should get a judgment within 4 to 6 weeks. And Voss," Seth folded the stay order and returned it to his vest, "the land fraud is a federal matter. The intimidation tactics may be harder to prosecute directly, but there's enough here for a thorough federal inquiry into his business practices. He knows that now. Men like Voss are very good at understanding when the calculation has changed." She was close enough that he could see the tension in her jaw, the slight trembling of her hands that she was controlling through sheer will. He thought about reaching out and covering one of those hands with his, and he did not do it, but the thought was there, and it was not going anywhere. "Come home," Cord said from behind them, meaning back to the homestead, meaning the practical thing, and Charlotte turned and nodded, and they walked out into the bright Kansas morning together. The weeks that followed were the slow, procedural kind of weeks that never make it into the exciting version of any story, but that are in fact the whole point. Seth filed the necessary documents. He corresponded with the federal court in Topeka. He worked with Elroy in Abilene to ensure the evidentiary record was complete and properly organized. He sat across from Daltrey twice more, in increasingly uncomfortable conversations for Daltrey, until the county clerk finally admitted, in writing and in the presence of a court-appointed witness, that the original ruling had been issued under pressure from outside the county office. Daltrey's admission named Voss. That single document changed the entire character of the case. Voss's attorney sent a letter to Seth the following week proposing a settlement. Voss would withdraw his claim and pay a civil penalty in exchange for a federal agreement not to pursue criminal charges related to the land fraud scheme. It was the kind of letter that arrives when a powerful man has looked at the board and realized the position is lost. Seth sent the letter to the federal prosecutor in Topeka and recommended against settlement, citing evidence of at least 3 separate instances of land fraud in addition to the Fletcher case. He recommended a full federal inquiry. Topeka agreed. Voss's empire in Caldera did not collapse immediately. The collapse happened gradually over the following year, as the federal inquiry worked its way through his business dealings with the patience and thoroughness that federal inquiries bring to situations where important people have done illegal things. The bank was placed under regulatory oversight. 2 of Voss's land acquisitions were reversed through federal action. He was ultimately indicted on 3 counts of mail fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit land fraud, and he left Caldera before the trial and did not come back. But that was later. In the immediate aftermath of the auction, what Charlotte had was the stay order and a reasonable certainty that the case was moving in the right direction, and a marshal who kept finding reasons to still be in Caldera. He was honest with himself about those reasons, eventually. It took him about another week. He was in the orchard with Charlotte, the 2 of them planting the last of the young apple trees she had bought in Abilene, and she was explaining with considerable earnestness the specific drainage requirements of apple trees and how the angle of the slope toward the creek would affect the root system. And Seth was holding a sapling and listening to her with more concentrated attention than drainage requirements probably warranted, when she caught him looking at her and not at the sapling, and she stopped talking. The silence between them had the quality of something that has been building for a while and has finally arrived. "I think," Charlotte said, "that this tree needs to go in the ground." "Yes," he agreed and planted it, and the moment passed, but something had been said without words that did not unsay itself. That evening Danny was doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table, and Charlotte and Seth were on the porch again, which had become a habit neither of them had formally agreed to, and Seth said, "I need to go to Topeka next week. The federal prosecutor wants to discuss the case directly." "I know," she said. "You told me. I'll be back within 10 days. She turned to look at him. Seth, first time she had used his given name, and he felt it the way you feel the first warm day after a long winter. "I know this is your job and you are doing it thoroughly because you are a thorough person, but I would like to know something before you go." He waited. "Are you coming back because of the case?" she said, "or for some other reason?" The directness of it would have startled him a month ago. Now it seemed entirely consistent with who she was and entirely fair. "Both," he said. "The case needs me here while it's active. That's true, and it's not the whole truth." She nodded. Then, after a moment, "I think you should know that I spent a long time after James died not thinking about anything except survival, making it through the seasons, getting Danny through the grief, working the land. It filled everything." She paused. "And then recently I've started noticing that some of the filling is different now. It's not I'm not sure how to say it properly." "You don't have to say it properly," he said. "I'm trying to say that I notice when you're not here," she said simply. Seth looked at the dark field beyond the porch rail, at the new leaves of the apple trees just visible against the last of the evening sky, at the creek with its perpetual silver movement in the dark. "I noticed the same," he said. "It was not poetry, but it was Seth Talbot, and it was exactly what he meant, and Charlotte knew it was exactly what he meant, and that was enough." He went to Topeka. He was back in 8 days. When he rode up to the homestead on the return, Danny came sprinting across the yard with a gap where a front tooth had been when Seth left, and Seth dismounted and listened to the detailed account of the tooth's departure, which had involved a piece of hard candy and a considerable quantity of drama. And when he looked up, Charlotte was standing in the doorway with her hands on either side of the door frame, watching him with her son. And the expression on her face was the most private and unguarded thing he had ever seen on a human face. He crossed the yard. He climbed the porch steps. He was close enough that he could see the small things: the flower on her sleeve from whatever she had been baking, the strand of dark hair that had escaped its pin, the exact particular quality of her dark eyes in the afternoon light, which were the color, he thought, of deep creek water where the shade falls. "Good trip?" she asked, and her voice was carefully ordinary. "Good trip," he said. "The prosecutor is satisfied with the evidentiary record. Daltrey's statement was what they needed." "So it's going to be all right." "Yes," he said, "it's going to be all right." She leaned against the doorframe and looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "I made apple cake. Danny found enough from last year's dried store. It's not particularly good because there isn't enough sugar, but we made it. I'd like some of that very much," he said. He ate the apple cake, which was exactly as rough as advertised and excellent, and Danny showed him a drawing he had made of the hawk's nest by the creek, and Seth said it was very good, which it was. The hawk rendered with an accuracy that suggested the boy had spent considerable time watching it. And then Danny was sent to finish his chores, and Charlotte and Seth were in the kitchen together, and she was washing the plates and he was drying them, which was a thing they had fallen into without discussion. And it was the most ordinary and most extraordinary moment Seth Talbot could recall in recent memory. She handed him a plate. Their hands touched at the exchange, and neither of them moved for a moment. "Charlotte," he said. She looked up at him. He set the plate down. He reached out and tucked the escaped strand of hair back from her face carefully, as if it required great attention. She turned her face slightly into his hand, the smallest movement, and then she was looking at him again with that open, unguarded expression, and he leaned forward and kissed her, gently, briefly, and then not so briefly. When they separated, she had her eyes closed for just a moment before she opened them, and then she said, "Well," in a tone that meant several things at once. "Well," he agreed. She laughed, which he had not heard her do in full before, and it was a sound that belonged in this kitchen, in this house, on this land, a sound that had been waiting to come back to a place it had been absent from for too long. The following weeks had the quality of something new growing, which made sense because everything around them that spring was growing, the orchard and the kitchen garden and the new grass along the creek, and the relationship between them that did not have a simple name yet, but that was present and real and changing daily. Seth was still working the case. He spent mornings writing correspondence and reviewing documents and making the quiet, meticulous progress that federal legal work requires. And he spent afternoons at the homestead, sometimes helping with physical work, mending the fence line and clearing brush from the creek bank and hauling supplies, and sometimes simply being present in the way that a person is present when they have decided that a place is where they want to be. Danny, who was a perceptive child despite being 8, observed all of this with the same steadiness his mother had, and asked Seth one afternoon, while they were repairing a fence post, whether Seth was going to marry his mother. Seth, who was not entirely sure how to have this conversation with an 8-year-old while holding a fence post in one hand and a hammer in the other, said that he thought that might depend on what Danny thought about it. Danny considered this seriously. Then he said that his father had told him once that the most important thing you could do with land was take care of it, and that his father had also told him that the most important thing you could do with people was take care of them too, and that he thought Seth was good at both of those things. Seth set down the hammer and looked at the boy for a long moment. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," he said. "He was," Danny said, with the simplicity of a child who misses someone without performing the missing. "I think he'd like you." Seth did not say anything immediately. He picked up the hammer and finished setting the post, and the creek made its sound in the middle distance, and the spring afternoon was warm and enormous around them. "I hope so," he said finally. He asked Charlotte that evening. They were on the porch in the long spring dusk, and it was not formally arranged. There was no getting down on one knee, no ceremony of it. He said, "I've been thinking about whether this can be something that lasts beyond the case closing," and she said she had been thinking the same thing, and he said, "I would like very much for it to," and she said, "So would I," and then they sat quietly for a while, and the creek moved in the dark, and the stars came out one by one over the Flint hills. "I should tell you," he said, "that marshalling is not a safe profession, and it is not always a pleasant one." "I know what it is," she said. "I've watched you do it for 2 months, and the district assignment is Wichita, which is a day's ride. I know where Wichita is. Charlotte." "Seth," she turned to face him fully. "I homesteaded this land with a man who was gone 3 days out of every 7 driving cattle before we had the herd established. I have buried that man and kept this land through a Kansas winter alone with an 8-year-old boy and one hired hand. I filed federal paperwork in my own name and rode to Abilene by myself and fought a land fraud case against a powerful man with more money than me." She paused. "I know what difficult looks like. What I am telling you is that you are not a difficulty. You are the opposite of one." He took her hand. It was a strong hand, the hand of someone who had worked land and kept a household and raised a child and refused to be removed from the life she had built. He held it carefully. "Will you marry me?" he said, not as a question with a rising inflection, but as the kind of statement that is also a question, the kind you ask when you already know but need to hear the answer in sound. "Yes," she said. The wedding was held on a Saturday in June at the small church in Caldera, with the minister presiding and me Dunning standing with Charlotte and Cord standing with Seth, and Danny sitting in the front pew with an expression of extreme seriousness that only broke once when his mother and Seth faced each other at the altar, and his mother smiled the full, unconstrained smile that she had been reclaiming that spring, and Danny smiled too, and then composed himself again. The church was full. because Caldera was a small town and a wedding was an event, and also because the people of Caldera had watched the events of the preceding months with considerable interest and had, on the whole, landed on the side of Charlotte Fletcher, the way that communities sometimes quietly choose a side while publicly remaining neutral. Seth said his vows with the same directness with which he did everything, looking at Charlotte's face and meaning every word, and Charlotte said hers looking right back at him, and the minister said a few kind words about new beginnings on good land, and then it was done, and the church erupted into the particular warmth of a celebration that a community has been holding in reserve. There was a dinner at Me Dunning's house after, with food contributed by half the town, and dancing on the porch with a fiddle player named Old Carl, who had been playing at celebrations in Caldera for 20 years and who showed no signs of stopping. Seth danced badly and was honest about it, and Charlotte danced with him anyway, and they turned in the summer evening while the fiddle played and the cottonwoods threw long shadows across the grass, and Danny danced with Me Dunning's youngest and showed surprising enthusiasm for it. That night, they rode home to the homestead together under the full June moon, Charlotte and Seth, and Danny fell asleep in the wagon before they reached the creek. Seth carried the boy inside and Charlotte put him to bed, and then they were alone in the house that had been Charlotte's alone for 18 months, and the creek made its sound outside, and the apple trees were small and straight in the moonlight through the kitchen window, and it was all exactly as it should be. In September, the federal judgment came through from Topeka confirming Charlotte Fletcher Talbot's legal ownership of the Sweetwater Creek homestead in full, with a formal declaration that the county's original ruling had been invalid and fraudulent. The judgment included a financial penalty against the county, a portion of which was awarded to Charlotte in compensation for the distress and legal costs of the preceding months. Seth read the judgment aloud to Charlotte at the kitchen table, and she listened with her hands flat on the table and her eyes very bright, and when he finished reading she was quiet for a long moment. "James," she said softly, not to Seth but to the room or to something beyond it. "We kept it." Seth folded the document carefully and placed it in front of her. The Voss federal indictment was filed that fall, and Voss did not contest it vigorously, which suggested that his attorneys had looked at the evidence and arrived at the same conclusion Seth had arrived at weeks earlier. He accepted a plea arrangement and was assessed substantial fines and a period of federal supervision. The bank in Caldera changed hands. Daltrey resigned from the county clerk's office and was replaced by a young man from Topeka who took the job seriously. Caldera did not immediately become a perfect place. Nowhere does, but the particular shadow that Voss had cast across the town lifted gradually, in the way that shadows lift when you remove the thing blocking the light. Seth negotiated a transfer to the eastern Kansas subdistrict, which reduced his regular riding territory and put his operational base closer to Caldera. It was not a desk job, and it was not a retirement, and there were still months when the work took him away for weeks at a time, but he came home to the homestead on Sweetwater Creek, and home was what it was. In the first winter of their marriage, Charlotte found she was expecting, and she told Seth on a Sunday morning in November with the snow coming down outside and a fire in the kitchen stove, and his face did something she had not seen it do before, which was to lose all of its habitual composure in a single unguarded moment, and he put his hands on either side of her face and held it like something precious and very carefully said, "Charlotte," and could not immediately say anything else. Danny was told at supper and received the news with the careful gravity of a 9-year-old who is privately very pleased but is too old, in his own estimation, to show it uncomplicated. He asked several practical questions about sleeping arrangements and whether he would be required to share the school books, and then he said, "I'm glad," with a directness that was entirely his mother's, and went back to his supper. The baby came in July, on a hot and bright summer day when the creek was low and the apple trees had their first real fruit on them, small and hard and green, not ready yet but there, promised. It was a boy, and they named him James after his grandfather and William after Seth's father, and he arrived loudly and with considerable emphasis, and proceeded to be, from the first day, the most opinionated person in a household that already contained several strong-willed people. Danny, who had been prepared for indifference toward an infant, discovered very quickly that he was not indifferent at all, and appointed himself a guardian of his brother's interests with a seriousness that made Charlotte laugh and made Seth quietly, profoundly proud. James William Talbot grew through that autumn and winter while the Voss case was concluded, and the homestead legal judgment became final, and the orchard trees grew, and the kitchen garden expanded, and Cord stayed on, and me Dunning came for supper every Sunday, and old Carl played his fiddle at the Christmas gathering that the Talbots hosted, because their house had somehow become the house where things happened. The following spring, Seth was home for most of it. The sub-district worked lighter that year, and he and Charlotte and Danny planted an additional row of apple trees in the orchard and extended the garden along the creek bank. And Seth built a proper fence around the kitchen garden that would actually keep the rabbits out, which Charlotte had been requesting since the second week of their marriage, and he built it carefully and with considerable attention to detail. And when it was done, Charlotte stood looking at it with her hands on her hips and said it was the most competent fence she had ever seen in her life. And Seth said, "Thank you," with complete seriousness, and she looked at him sideways. And he was absolutely not hiding a smile, and she threw a handful of garden soil at him, and he caught her hand instead. And James was sitting in the dirt nearby watching his parents with the wide, interested eyes of a 1-year-old, who is taking extensive notes on the behavior of adults. 2 years later, Charlotte was expecting again, and this time it was a girl, born in March when the snow was still on the ground and the creek was running full with snowmelt, and the apple trees were still bare but already budding. They named her Ruth after Charlotte's mother, and she had Seth's gray eyes and Charlotte's dark hair, and a personality that combined the stubbornness of both of her parents into something formidable that became apparent approximately 8 months into her life, and did not diminish thereafter. Danny, by then 12 and already taller than his mother, took his role as eldest with a seriousness that sometimes made Seth look at Charlotte across the room in a silent exchange of parental amusement, because the boy was becoming so very like both of them, the steadiness of Charlotte and the thoroughness of Seth, a combination that boded extremely well for his future and made him, in the present, occasionally somewhat trying to argue with. The homestead on Sweetwater Creek grew into something that James Fletcher had imagined, and Charlotte Fletcher had refused to let be taken, and Seth Talbot had helped defend, and that all of them together had built into the life they lived. The orchard came into full production in the 5th year, and the apples were everything the soil had promised, and Charlotte made preserves and pies and a hard cider that became somewhat famous among their neighbors. And Seth came home from a 6-week circuit through the western subdistrict one autumn evening to find the kitchen full of the smell of it, and Charlotte standing at the stove with Ruth on her hip and James running around the table for reasons that were not immediately clear, and Danny reading at the table with the calm of someone who has learned to exist peacefully at the center of chaos. He stood in the doorway for a moment before any of them noticed him, taking in the whole of it, the warmth and the noise and the good smell of apple and wood smoke, and the particular living brightness of his family in the house on the land that ran down to the creek. And he thought about the telegram that had crossed his desk 2.5 years ago from a clerk in Abilene, and about the road he had ridden to get to this particular doorway, and about all the places that road had gone that he had not anticipated when he set out. Danny looked up from his book. "Pa's home," he said, in the tone of someone announcing a fact rather than expressing surprise, but his mouth was already moving toward a smile. Charlotte turned, and Ruth turned with her, and the baby's face opened into the enormous pleased expression of a very small person who has identified someone important, and Charlotte's face did the thing it did when she looked at him. That open, unguarded thing that he had fallen in love with before he had known he was falling, and she said, "We kept supper." "I know you would," he said, and came in from the doorway. Later, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet except for the fire and the creek outside, Charlotte sat beside Seth on the old settle they had bought from Mee Dunning when Mee's nephew brought her newer furniture from Topeka, and she leaned against him with her head on his shoulder and he had his arm around her, and the lamp was burning low and the land lay quiet outside in the autumn dark. "Are you tired?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Good tired." She turned the gold ring on her finger, the way she sometimes did when she was thinking. He had learned to read the things she did with her hands, the way you learn to read the things a land does with water and light, by sustained and devoted attention over time. "The inspector from Topeka came while you were out," she said. "The one doing the follow-up assessment on the Voss land transfers. He said the last two are going to be settled by spring. The ranchers will get their property back." "Good," Seth said. He also said Daltrey's moved to Colorado. "Good place for a fresh start if you mean it," Seth said. He paused. "Do you think he means it?" "I think he was a man who made a bad choice when a powerful man offered him a way out of debt," Charlotte said thoughtfully. "Whether he would make the same choice again depends on what kind of trouble finds him in Colorado." A pause. "I hope he makes a better one." Seth turned his face toward the top of her head. She smelled of apple and wood smoke and herself, the specific, familiar, irreplaceable smell of Charlotte, and he closed his eyes for a moment with the completeness of someone who has arrived where they were going and knows it with certainty. "I thought about this place," he said, "while I was riding circuit. This room." "What about it?" "Just this, the way it is right now." He pulled her slightly closer. "I don't carry a picture of it, I can't draw worth anything. But I have it in here," he touched his chest, "and I go back to it when the road is long." She was quiet for a moment and then she said very softly, "I didn't know that." "You do now." She lifted her head and looked at him. The lamplight caught the deep color of her eyes, the particular warmth in them that was only for him and their children, the light that did not go out. "Seth," she said. "Charlotte." She smiled, the full smile, the one that had come back to her that spring like the apple trees coming back to leaf. And she kissed him, and the fire crackled, and outside the creek moved over its stones in the dark as it always had and always would, indifferent and constant, threading through the bottom land that Charlotte Fletcher Talbot had refused to lose, and Seth Talbot had walked through a door to save. On a spring morning in 1878, when the gavel came down and the wrong man celebrated and a marshal walked into the room and changed everything. The land was theirs. The children were growing. The creek ran full in spring and low in summer and steady through every winter, and the apple trees came into their abundance year by year. And the house on Sweetwater Creek had more life in it than James Fletcher had dared to imagine when he first broke the ground and drove the stakes and believed, the way the best people believe, in the future that good work could build. On the morning of their 5th wedding anniversary, Seth woke before Charlotte and went out to the porch in the early gray light, and the hills were beginning to catch the color of the coming sunrise, and the creek was silver in the half-dark below. And the apple orchard stood in its rows, full and established now. The trees no longer the uncertain saplings of those first springs, but genuine trees with their own weight and presence in the land. Danny was 17 and talking about law school, which made Seth laugh with a quiet, private wonder every time he thought about it. The circle of it. A boy who had grown up watching a martial use, law as a tool to preserve justice, now wanting to hold that tool himself. Charlotte had written to 2 colleges in the East and gotten back responses that were encouraging, and the money from the orchard and the homestead income over 5 years was enough to make the possibility real. James was 4 and universally convinced that he was old enough to do every task on the property, which made him useful and occasionally catastrophic. He had his grandfather's steadiness already emerging beneath the 4-year-old's energy. That quality of looking at a problem from all sides before attempting it, and he had Seth's habit of not saying things until he was sure of what he meant to say, which was remarkable in a child of 4 and made Charlotte say, regularly, that there were 2 of them now and she was outnumbered. Ruth was 2 and not outnumbered by anything, being entirely capable of out-arguing anyone in the household, including Danny, a fact that Danny found both impressive and deeply inconvenient. Seth looked at his land in the early light and thought about the marshal he had been before all of this, the man who traveled constantly and came home to a boarding house room, and who had told a woman in Wichita, truthfully, that he could not be what she needed. He thought about that man with something that was not regret and not entirely different from it, the particular feeling of recognizing a past self with understanding and without judgment. He had become someone else, not all at once, but the way land changes, season by season, accumulating the evidence of rain and work and time. He was still a marshal, still the thorough, careful man who did not let cases go until they were properly done. But he was also a man with a porch and an orchard and a creek, and 4 people inside a house who were the coordinates of his life, the points he navigated by. The sunrise came over the hills in its full extravagance of pink and gold, and the creek caught the light and ran brilliant, and the apple trees stood in their rows in the morning, and from inside the house came the sound of Ruth's voice raised in the absolute conviction of a 2-year-old who has discovered that the day has started without her. Seth went inside. Charlotte was already in the kitchen, Ruth on her hip and coffee beginning on the stove, and her hair was loose around her shoulders the way it only was in the mornings before she pinned it up, and she looked at him coming in from the porch with the specific look that she reserved for him, the open, warm look that was private and particular and entirely his, and she said, "Happy anniversary, Marshal." He crossed the kitchen and took Ruth from her arm and held the small, fierce creature who was his daughter, and he put his other arm around Charlotte, and he said, "Happy anniversary," against the top of her head. Ruth said something extremely emphatic that was mostly syllables. James appeared in the doorway of his room with his dark hair standing up in multiple directions, and his father's gray eyes and the expression of someone who has arrived with important news. "The creek is very high this morning," he reported. "I looked from the window. I think it rained in the night." "You should eat breakfast before you inspect the creek," Charlotte said. "I know," James said, with the gravity of someone acknowledging a rule they intend to follow as soon as they have finished their urgent business, and disappeared back toward the window. Danny came in last, already more than half dressed, because Danny at 17 had developed his mother's habit of being functional before the rest of the house was ready, and he poured himself a coffee with the ease of someone who has been drinking it for longer than he probably should have, and he said, "5 years," looking at his mother and Seth, and nodded in the manner of someone making a favorable assessment of an outcome. Charlotte said, "5 years," back at him, in the tone that she had for her eldest child, warmth and acknowledgement and the very particular love of a mother for the child she had raised through the hard years, through the loss and the fight and the survival, who had come out the other side steady and tall, and looking toward his future with the same clear-eyed pragmatism that had always been the best quality of both his parents. Seth handed Ruth back to Charlotte and poured his own coffee and stood in the kitchen of the house on the land on the creek in the morning light, and he thought, this is what it was for. The case. The telegram from Abilene and the hard ride from Wichita and the federal documents and the auction house, and the words he had spoken that silenced a room. This. The coffee and the creek running high in the April morning and the children and the orchard and Charlotte Fletcher Talbot looking at him across the kitchen in the specific way she did, which meant, "You are here, and I know you are here, and everything is as it should be." The land had never been legally on the block. It had belonged, from the moment the ground was first broken, to the people who worked it and loved it and refused to let it go. The law had simply needed reminding of that. And sometimes that was all justice required, the right person walking through the right door at the right moment, and saying the true thing out loud in a room that needed to hear it. Seth Talbot had been that person on a Wednesday morning in the spring of 1878. He did not think of it as the heroic act it might have appeared from the outside. He thought of it as the doing of a job, the thorough completion of a necessary thing. But he also thought that it was the best thing he had ever done, because it had led him here, to this kitchen, to this morning, to these people who were his family on this land that was their home. And outside, Sweetwater Creek ran silver through the bottom land in the early April light, and the apple trees stood in their ordered rows heavy with the promise of another summer's abundance, and the Flint hills rolled away to the horizon under a sky so wide it could make a person feel both free and entirely, completely, perfectly at home.